In the vaults of Candlekeep there exists one tome among many, In the Wake of Blue Fire, The Wailing Years. It is no doubt a fascinating read. Pages filled with devastated lands, vanished people, fallen empires, and dead gods. Riveting accounts of colliding worlds, new cosmologies, and time lost. Even the rewriting of the very genesis of our world. Fascinating indeed. Unfortunately, the accounts of these 4th edition scholars do not reside with other writings of fiction, as perhaps they should. No, you will find this literary work chronicling the Spellplague of 1385 Dale Reckoning, surrounded by the ancient histories of our realms, the rise and fall of the creator races, the first flight of dragons, the crown wars, even the tragedies of the Drow people. However, if one were to really read between the lines, you might begin to suspect these 4th edition sages cared not for the preservation of the canonical histories of our realm, choosing instead to chase the grinding of new reputations in some other world of Warcraft. You think Shadowheart's struggle to reclaim her stolen memories is tragic? Try recovering a century lost amid broken calendars, erased by Spellplague authors whitewashing the truth with bold claims of dark ages and mass amnesia. And therein lies the real danger of these heresies. When the historians are the heretics, what other truths get buried? The kind that demand investigation. This is 10 for 30. Give me 30 minutes and today I will give you 10 sins of the Spellplague that were mostly cleansed by the lore of the 5th edition. And for you players of Baldur's Gate 3 or those just interested in its lore, stick around until the very end as the credits roll for a bonus section where I will share an obscure lore nugget and a world-building tip. And with that, let the Inquisition begin. We must start our discoveries with what is perhaps the most paradigm-shifting change in all of 4th edition. A proposed truth so disruptive it was buried for over 30 millennia, unearthed only by the chaos of the Spellplague. This revelation would tell us our planet of Toril was not as unique as once thought, its horizon now filled with the presence of a twin planet named Abir. In a trend that will become quite common among the 4th edition texts, much of its new knowledge was not invented from whole cloth, instead leaning heavily into the mystical use of power word retcon on the established histories of our realm. And it would take no time to see this indifference be first leveraged. As wise scribes of the classical text have likely already noted, the firmament upon which the Forgotten Realms was built was actually always called Abir Toril, going back to the earliest texts of the 1st edition. It would be TSR designer Jeff Grubb working with the Forgotten Realms creator Ed Greenwood on the original 1st edition Realms box set in 1987 who would add the Abir prefix. Internal canon would then assign Abir Toril as meaning cradle of life in the ancient language of creation. However, with an apathy bordering on contempt for the known histories, heretical 4E sages offered a new origin story for our world. That Abir Toril was not a single planetary orb as we had always thought, but in fact two. And for countless millennia, this was a secret known only to the gods. With the grace of a drunken ogre, 4th edition scholars would insist that approximately 32,000 years ago, the overgod Ao had actually cleaved that original planet in two, in order to end an also just discovered ancient conflict between elemental lords called primordials and the young pantheon of nascent gods. The Dawn War they called it, and it was just the beginning. As we flash back to the Spellplague of 1385, those souls fortunate enough to have avoided both the literary and literal flames of this 4th edition calamity might not yet be aware of the sudden and violent lore disruptions that this change would foreshadow. But you will. With the start of the Spellplague era, the once familiar maps of the Forgotten Realms would begin to reflect a world in seizure, as the interloper planet of Abir began its collision with our world, at least in the metaphysical sense. The geographic upheaval that would result was nothing less than catastrophic. Entire continents such as Mastika ripped from the planet, while savage destruction was laid upon those that remained. The Sea of Fallen Stars saw its floor split as more than 50 feet of sea level drained into the Underdark, leaving ports landlocked and stranded, economies shattered, its people displaced or dead. Vasa was mutated into the Tainted Plague Lands, Luskan fell to volcanic ruin, and unprecedented floods engulfed Chult, transforming the lush jungle peninsula into an isolated island overnight. South Faerunian elves of the Misty Vale saw its forest decay, withering into a dying desert the lore would call Elfharrow. Even the tranquil Moonshae Isles were corrupted into a nightmarish Fey realm, stalked and haunted by giants and aberrations. The vast grasslands of the Shar became barren wasteland as swaths of the landscape collapsed to form the Underchasm, a miles-deep void exposing the surface world to the Underdark below. The Great Rift would take the brunt of the region's devastation, the traditional homeland of the Gold Dwarves swallowed by the canyon-like Underchasm, leaving only ruins. In time, the 5e lore would begin the slow ecological process of healing, some explainable, others left to powers beyond mortal understanding. The tainted lands of plague and desolation would be cleansed and renewed during the Second Sundering. The lost lands of Maztica returned to Toril, and the waters of the Great Floods receded, allowing coastlines such as Chult to once again reconnect to the mainland. The Underchasm would be sealed when a chosen of the goddess of beauty, Sune, sacrificed herself to forge a pact with the primordial Earth Lord, Grumbar. And history would note the great weather event to follow, one to rival a certain man named Noah and his ark. Dark clouds would form, curiously isolated precisely over the Sea of Fallen Stars, and there they would remain as a relentless rain fell for approximately 16 months. A deluge that refilled the Sea of Fallen Stars within inches of its old shores, before giving way to blue skies, dissipating forever with no fanfare in what can only be described as a celestial level of knowing. The rehabilitation of the Second Sundering would ensure the planet remembered its ancient landscapes even when the gods seemed to forget. But the sins of the Spellplague would yet come in many new forms, including the return of ghosts thought long perished. Not all sins of the Spellplague were acts of planetary destruction. Some were of resurrection, and no haunting spirit of the past returned more unwelcome than the shadow of hubris. The 4th edition would dredge forth a darkened return of Netheril, the floating city of shade wrapped in the embrace of the dark goddess Shar. Founded originally as Tulthantar by the Netherese, first existing during the infamous time known as the Folly of Karsus, the Enclave had survived for 1,000 years in the Plane of Shadow. Empowered by the Spellplague's chaos and the will of Shar, the Shadowvar immediately began a campaign of conquest in the name of the Dark Lady of Lost. They subjugated the merchant nation of Symbia and waged war against Cormyr and the Dalelands before the 5th edition lore would deliver its poetic justice, led by the sage of Shadowdale himself, Elminster. The sinister return of the Netherese Empire would collapse again in 1487. Following in the arrogant footsteps of Karsus, the Archmage Telemont Tanthal sought to absorb the power of Myth-Draenor's Mythal. In the battle that would follow, a 3-way conflict that also drew the Lich Larlock into the fray, Tanthal was killed by Elminster, the City of Shade crashing upon Myth-Draenor, destroying both in the process. And just like that, the threat that had loomed over the north for the duration of the 4th edition era was annihilated with finality, its leaders dead, its dark armies scattered. All that remains of Netheril today are its crumbled ruins and the tales told by the handful of survivors that remain. Harsh justice? Perhaps, but also fitting. Ancient arrogance toppled by its own overreach yet again. The changes brought on by 4th edition text were not limited to maps and shadowy enclaves. They also reached into the bloodlines of the realm's people. In a move made to prioritize game mechanics, several core races were altered. Tieflings, once rare individuals bearing the unique marks of their varied fiendish ancestry, were homogenized into a single, cohesive infernal race, all said to be descended from an ancient empire's Faustian pact with the Lord of the Nine, Asmodeus. Dragonborn, previously a rarity hailing from distant lands across Toril, were retconned as refugees from the lands of the alien world of Abir, arriving with no Faerunian ancestry. Even the elven people fractured nonsensically, spinning off Eladrin as entirely separate strangers, tied intrinsically to the 4E introduced Feywild. In rectifying these absurdities, the 5e lore sought to restore lost racial complexity. The Tiefling's singular origin was undone, made once again a diverse people with a myriad of mixed infernal and abyssal bloodlines. The Alberian Dragonborn of Timanther still exist in the modern lore, illustrating how a retcon should be done. 5th edition would introduce other Dragonborn, elegantly weaving into Torill's ancestral history, making them a native race to blend and balance with the invading Dragonborn immigrants. The Eladrin were reclassified as an elven subrace, reuniting their fragmented lineage. The 5th edition writings did take steps to acknowledge the events of the Spellplague, but frames the lore within the broader, more diverse context of the established canon. The races of Torill were made whole again, their histories reclaimed from a period of artificial simplicity. It was another, this time quieter correction that restored the nuanced qualities of races that the 4th edition traded away for convenience. But such racial courtesies would not extend to everyone. The wrath of the Spellplague was often delivered as a blunt instrument, felling empires and villages with the same careless indifference. But its cruelty may never have been sharper than when it turned on the small folk. The island of Lanton would be the first target. Inhabited by innovative gnomes and their fantastic inventions, Lanton was home to a people devoted to their deity, the Lord of all Smiths and Holy Maker of all things, Gond. Yet their god would not save them, as the island nation was obliterated in 1385 by a chain reaction of exploding smoke powder and magical reagents, only to see the flames doused along with gnomish lives as the isle was swallowed whole by the waves of a Spellplague-born tsunami. The following year, tragedy would find its way over 2,000 miles to the east in the southernmost reaches of Faerun. Lurin, the idyllic homeland kingdom of the halflings resting on the coast of the Great Sea, would sadly not escape its own similar fate. Overwhelmed by a series of colossal rogue waves and rising tides, the rolling hills and borough towns of Lurin's coastal cities of Krenalar, Shun, Chethel, and its capital Baldur were each submerged beneath the savage waves, the floods forming a new arm of the sea, mockingly renamed the Gulf of Lurin. In an instant of bleak narrative choice, two entirely peaceful cultures pointlessly vanished with little regard or respect, the 4th edition history treating the small folk societies as inconveniences to their myopic grand vision. Thankfully, this despicable sin would not be forgotten in the repairs of the 5th edition. Lanton, it was later revealed, had not been entirely destroyed under the trackless sea, a portion of its people transported to Abir. 5e lore would return them to Torill to see the waters recede, allowing the island to bask in the sun once again. Lurin too would find the coastlines of their halfling homeland made dry, allowing the surviving Hin to return and begin the slow process of rebuilding. Some may view these as only minor acts of mercy, and perhaps in the scope of all the crimes of the Spellplague, that is indeed true. Regardless, I find the healing gestures of the 5e lore to be deeply symbolic of the senseless and short-sighted perspective held by the 4th edition. Their return in the 5th edition speaking volumes to a core theme of these cleansings, a renewed commitment that no story is truly over and no home is ever truly lost. Unfortunately, the destructive appetite of this era would not be satisfied with pastoral kingdoms and island workshops. As we would soon discover, the Spellplague sought to consume much larger victims. As we reach the midpoint of our countdown, I think most would agree the devastation laid upon the small folk was undeniably callous, but it would be the annihilation of great empires that history would read as a blasphemy of 4th edition lore. The ancient magic-rich nations of Halrua, Mulharand, and Unther were effectively erased from the map by the Spellplague. 4th edition would tell us that Halrua detonated under its own arcane might, though rumors persisted that its most powerful mages had managed to shift some fraction of their kingdom to the invading world of Abir. The ancient empires of Mulharand and Unther, on the other hand, were simply destroyed and replaced. Mulhoran's ruins settled by the new empire of High Imiskar, while Unther's former domain was taken over by the Alberian dragonborn migration of Timanther. Sacrificing these unique empires for the sake of removing cultures some might deem problematic felt like a profound loss of lore. Because it was. And the 5th edition would agree, leveraging the displacement rumors in Halrua's return from Albir just as the whispers suggested, its wizard kings re-establishing their reclusive nation. Unther too would also be reunited with Toril, although greatly diminished from its former glory. In its return, we would also learn that the surviving Untherite and Mulhorandi people had been subjected to the evils of slavery by Shryan Genasi during their time on Albir. Unther's return would spark a war with the Dragonborn of Timanther, now squatters in Untherite territory, a war that still rages today, Unther reclaiming only a portion of their ancestral lands thus far. It would also be revealed later that the Untheric god king Gilgum, seeking to win the freedom of his people against those Alberian Genasi, had made an unholy alliance with the demon lord Grast. However, for the Mulhorandi people, the Second Sundering would do what 4E refused, taking a nuanced approach in their return to Toril. The Mulhorandi pantheon and its people would be restored, empowering the nation to overthrow the Imiskari occupiers and reclaim their homeland. However, in their return, the Mulhoran god kings would bring with them the wisdom gained through their experiences on Albir, abolishing the practice of slavery, an evolution of their society taught through the hard lessons of their own bound servitude to the Genasi. Remarkable the insights that can be found by simply walking a day in the life of another man's shoes. Still, in the Second Sundering's rebirth of old empires, weary and diminished from their exile, a new question would soon arise. If the mortal thrones of Faerun were so unstable, what of the celestial crowns in the heavens? In case you thought the devastations of retcon were limited to terrestrial boundaries, witness the Spellplague's reach upward into the heavens to brutally cull the divine pantheon, and doing so with the discerning eye of a goblin thief sorting treasure, tossing anything that wasn't shiny enough. In this celestial massacre, gods were slain, vanished, or merged. While we must save the death of one particular deity for its own entry on this list of sins, there were still many notable casualties, both surprising and needless. Some deities, such as the Morning Lord Lathander and the Netherese Keeper of the Golden Sun Amanatur, were merged, or better explained, they were revealed to be the same god under different aspects, coalescing their once diverse faiths into a singular doctrine. Religious confusion and fear gripped the faithful across the realms, as domains and portfolios changed hands seemingly overnight. Perhaps the most shocking, however, were the fates of Helm, the god of guardians, and Tyr, the god of justice. In a tragic, convoluted affair orchestrated by Cyric, Tyr was tricked into slaying Helm in a duel. Overcome with grief when the deceit was finally revealed, Tyr abdicated his own divinity and himself vanished, leaving the scales of justice empty and ungoverned. The Drow pantheon, known as the Dark Seldarine, would also not escape the carnage. Lolth's former champion, Selvatarn, the Drow god of slaughter and now her rival, would be the first to fall, dying at the hands of a mortal Dark Song Knight of the goddess Ilastraii. His departure would be followed by a conflict between the same Ilastraii, the beacon of hope for good-aligned Drow, and her equally evil brother Veyron, god of Drow ambition. Ilastraii slaying Veyron and controlling his portfolio. The Spellplague would also claim the deity of arcane magic and servant of Mystra. In Nessus, Asmodeus would defeat Azuth and then fuse with his dying essence, saving the god of wizards' life while at the same time stealing his divinity and form. Even the rules of the afterlife would be distorted in the 4th edition text, as the Raven Queen, newly appointed as the goddess of death and fate, would significantly diminish the influence of Kelemvor, the judge of the dead, and in the process reducing the role and significance of the Wall of the Faithless that surrounds the Fugue Plane to near omission. The events of the Second Sundering would revivify and stabilize the Pantheon, heralding a time of dogmatic resurrection. Tyr and Helm both returned to life, their faiths restored, bringing renewed order to the realms. Veyron would also rise from his proverbial grave, emerging no longer the mortal rival of his sister Ilastraii, both now united in opposition of their mother, the demonic Spider Queen Lolth. And in a have-your-cake-and-eat-it-too solution, Asmodeus would stand as one of the few to actually benefit from this era of divine culling. Azuth and Asmodeus would reclaim and retain their respective godhood thanks to the efforts of Azuth's chosen Ilstan and a chosen of Asmodeus named Faraday. In a bargained-for divine ritual, Asmodeus would agree to release Azuth in exchange for the divine spark of the untheric moon god Nana Sin, preserving his own lawful evil divinity in the process. Even the rules of Afterlife would quietly return closer to their pre-4th edition form, drastically reducing the role of the Raven Queen. No longer the goddess of death and quite possibly now completely insane, she resides in her Fortress of Memories located in the Shadowfell, where she collects and obsesses over every fragment of past mortal thought. When all was said and done, the heavens had recovered, yet blemishes remain as permanent reminders of divine violence used recklessly as a narrative shortcut to simplicity. We have thus far seen the Spellplague's wrath upon the realm's lands, its nations and people, the divine pantheon, even the afterlife. So what's left to destroy in the name of the 4th edition Pillars of Light? How about the structure of existence? The Great Wheel cosmology of the 1st and 2nd edition was a model that created and defined the inner and outer planes. And while the 3rd edition's move to the World Tree framework would provide a more thematic structure, it did not fundamentally erase, merge, or destroy any planes or alter their lore with any significance. However, that would not be the case with the World Access model introduced in the 4th edition. The astral sea above, the elemental chaos below, and the mortal world sandwiched in between. The inner and outer planes were merged, or in many cases destroyed, their distinct identities lost in the chaotic elemental soup, or reduced to a floating island in a silvery void. It was an unneeded and unwanted change forced upon the realms in the name of, here's that word again, a simple, streamlined structure. It would be the cosmological redemption that came in the 5th edition that to many planar scholars ranks among the smartest of the reversals found in the 5e texts, starting first and foremost with its return to a Great Wheel model that closely resembles the classic 2e version and also brought some notable and welcome additions. Chief among those additions are the inclusion of perhaps the best lore introduced in the 4th edition, the Plains of the Feywild and the Shadowfell. And do you know why they were so well received? Because they did not go out of their way to destroy established histories and lore in their creation. Or to put a finer point on it, unlike most other 4th edition lore, the Feywild and Shadowfell were not written with the subtlety of disarming a trap with a fireball. The return of the Great Wheel brought back a stable and familiar reality, but in remodeling the architecture of existence, many historians and planar sages were left to wonder what catalyst held the power to enact such change in the first place. Every great fire starts with a spark, and if any single event can be condemned as igniting the Spellplague and its path of death and destruction, it is undeniably the murder of the goddess of magic at the hands of Cyric and Will of Shar in 1385 Dale Reckoning. When Mystra fell, the structure of realms magic called the Weave failed spectacularly as magic across the realms became unreliable and dangerous. The loss of the Weave resulted in the collapse of its ethereal and arcane guardrails, allowing the chaos of raw magic to spread uncontrolled like a nuclear fallout, its untamed and virulent energies instantly scorching all reaches of the world, manifesting in unpredictable and deadly forms. To undo such a foundational change as divine homicide, the Second Sundering would have to bring its own full retcon. The lore was not elegant, but it was necessary, revealing that Mystra had only been sorta, kinda, but not really or truly killed. Instead, a vestige of her essence remained, what the 5e lore would call a state of torpor, preserved by her chosen to slowly reclaim her divine spark until such time as she would be fully restored. That time would begin with the Second Sundering of 1480 Dale Reckoning, with her full return in 1487. And just like her death was the spark that ignited the Spellplague, so too would her restoration end the ravages of blue fire. Yet, amid the remnant debris of its existence, the Spellplague would leave its most enduring reminder in its own death rattle. While the maelstrom of Spellplague storms raged for a decade, it was a corrupting infection left in the remains that would take a century to claim its victims, not with its magic or violent force, but with the simple, unstoppable passage of time. We arrive at our number one sin of the Spellplague at the end of an era of great change, to find a land littered with the fragments of realms lore shattered, the Second Sundering having reconstructed the pieces and their legacies of lore as best it could. Unfortunately, the most eternal of the Spellplague's many sins would endure long after the storm subsided, becoming a forever footnote in the chronicles of our forgotten realms. It was not a change to the maps, the gods, or even the cosmos. It was the indelible break of the realm's calendar. It might surprise you to learn that each edition of the Dungeons & Dragons lore, excluding the 4th edition of course, accounts for only a handful of in-universe years. In fact, if you total the sum of years that chronicle all the stories and adventures that occurred as current events in each edition, starting in 1357 at the launch of 1st edition through 1376, the year upon which the 3.5 era concludes, you would then find a grand total of just 19 years of Realms lore. Even adding the 10 Realms years that have transpired since the launch of 5e and the Second Sundering of 1484, that's still just 29 years, far less than the combined meta years in the real world in which each edition was considered current. Now, some of you may be scratching your head at how I started in 1357 with the 1st edition, ended in 1494 with the 5th edition, and then listened to me claim only 29 years had passed. Maybe I'm the one with the math problem. Well, hopefully you noted my preface of excluding the 4th edition, which is why we are forced down this little rabbit hole of calendar dates in the first place. Because that tight narrative lore window of less than 3 decades was completely obliterated with the launch of the 4th edition lore. To understand what is the lost century, we must first dissect 4th edition's flawed architecture. While the Spellplague would strike only 9 years after the 3.5 era ended, the chronicles of 4e actually began only in the century of its aftermath, canonically in 1479. Despite all its devastation wrought, the Spellplague was nothing more than a convenient plot device positioned retrospectively in the lore as a long-past historical event. A cataclysm invented and then used to justify the 100-year chasm separating the modern era of 4th edition from a canonical past their new lore wanted everyone to desperately forget. And this change would have far more profound impacts than just a date on a calendar. For much of the lore, it was, in fact, a death sentence. You see, to advance a century in this way means that, canonically, many beloved characters would vanish, dying off-screen unceremoniously to adventure or old age, which is precisely why all other editions maintained that tight in-universe timeline that I demonstrated. Instead, with the 4th edition, long-running storylines, events, and of course many lives just abruptly ended, creating a jarring disconnect from the world and the lore Realms players knew and loved. And that was the intent, a selfish act of wiping the canvas clean that unsurprisingly felt to many like the betrayal that it actually was. An answer to a question no one had asked, a solution in desperate search of a problem. And unfortunately, this was the one sin that even the Second Sundering could not fully atone for. Time, once passed, cannot be unpassed, at least not in any clean way that would not create its own litany of compounding new issues. 4th edition had cast the die, the time happened, the century was forever lost. All the 5th edition lore could really do was create a narrative bridge, taking the form of created events in order to fill the void of silence in the calendar's gaps, to try and reconnect the severed threads of history with limited success. It was once reported that around 2006, a few years before the launch of 4th edition, that R.A. Salvatore, author of the many popular Drizzt books, upon hearing about the intended lost century would quip that, quote, 140-year-old humans don't fight very well, end quote. Interestingly, his 2013 novel, The Companions, would center around those human and halfling characters orbiting the lore of the Drizzt novels, being given a chance by the goddess Myleki to reincarnate with full memories of their previous existence. This was no doubt a cliché, but again necessary narrative device to both acknowledge the lost century and yet try to mitigate its effects, retaining characters who might otherwise have died quietly to Father Time and the setting's forever broken timeline. The lore of 5th edition made a noble but mostly unconvincing attempt to make the world of 1489 feel like a natural progression from the world of 1379. Still, the 4th edition's calendar retcon will forever remain a blemish on the realm's timeline. The world would never be able to forget the lost century, it would just have to learn to live with its remnant scars. As we reflect on the meaningless devastation of this era, it is worth contemplating if we've even been asking the right question. Perhaps the greatest sin of the Spellplague was not all that it destroyed, but what it stole and could never return. The 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons was a bold, if ill-conceived vision that lost its way by chasing trends. Hungry to reinvent itself in order to capture new markets and create MMO-style game mechanics, 4E sacrificed what has always been what made D&D so special, its deep lore. But this story on the sins of the 4th edition is as much about its 5th edition redemption arc. All who enjoy the Forgotten Realms owe a debt of gratitude to its most loyal stewards. Voices such as Ed Greenwood and R.A. Salvatore, and even reflective 4E critics like Mike Merles, who each listen to their own convictions as well as the deafening roar of the community. Their dedication would ensure that the Forgotten Realms would not itself be forgotten. So what are your thoughts on these 10 sins of the Spellplague? Did I miss one you expected? Was I too harsh? Do you agree 5e was successful in unwinding the 4th edition changes, or could they have done more? Or perhaps you're a devout follower of the 4e lore and now want to fight me down in the comments. Let your voice be heard. I read all and respond to most. And if you enjoy these deeply OCD researched explorations, help a fellow lore scholar out and offer a tribute to the divine algorithm by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And maybe explore my Patreon, where you can join for free or toss a copper my way with a Buy Me a Coffee donation. Links below. A sincere thank you to my channel members and my Patreon supporters who both make these long-form deep dives entirely possible. And thank you for watching. I hope we can do it again real soon. Until then, take care, my friends. And now, as promised, some final thoughts in the form of an obscure lore fragment and world-building tip for you Baldur's Gate 3 veterans, or even those fresh from the Nautiloid crash. The BG3 video game is set in the year 1492, and a key prelude to the stories to unfold include the fall of El Turel into the Hells of Avernus, with the events surrounding the home of the Hell Riders having just concluded, and El Turel back safely upon the banks of the river Kianthar. But did you know that canonically, El Turel's fall happened exactly 50 years after the human priest and ruler of El Turel, Fabius Krieg, signed a Faustian pact with Zariel, the archdevil of Avernus, in 1444? And did you also know that Zariel's claim to that bargain was to occur precisely 50 years after said signature? So doing the simple math places El Turel's fall squarely in 1494, 2 years after your story begins. A simple math error? Maybe. A pedantic point? Absolutely. But also a factual one. But true scholars know that in the Forgotten Realms there aren't really any errors, only conspiracies, obfuscated truths, beliefs, and opportunities. So let me offer a more thematic possibility for your consideration. Shar, the Dark Lady of Loss who caused the Lost Century, loves to meddle with memory and time. Perhaps it is fitting then that her chosen cleric, Shadowheart, wanders Faerun with a stolen past, in a timeline that is itself broken. Creative world builders and dungeon masters might use this for your own Baldur's Gate 3 inspired adventure. Treat it as evidence, a clue that the official histories might be a lie, a hint that some force pulled El Turel into the Hells ahead of schedule, or perhaps just a quiet reminder from a dark goddess that she can alter anything, even the timeline. Just something to muse the next time your table seeks new adventures in the familiar confines of the Baldur's Gate lore. And with that, keep your histories close and your calendars closer. You never know who's been editing them. Until next time.